Welcome in, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about RevOps knowledge transfer and what you need to know before it's too late. This webinar is sponsored by our amazing partner, Sweep, and we are joined today by Aviv Bergman, Head of Partnerships at Sweep. Be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A section, as we will be answering them live with our amazing panel. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aviv, and we'll get started. Enjoy, everyone.
Hi, thank you, Gina, and thanks, RevGenius, for co-hosting this webinar with us with Sweep. As Gina said, I'm Aviv. I'm talking from New York, and I'm talking from Sweep. A word about Sweep before we start. Sweep is a visual workspace for Salesforce. We're going to talk about this later. Today, we're here to talk about much more important things. And it's actually a very interesting topic for a webinar, personally for me, and I'll explain why before I'll go into the introductions. I've been in RevOps in the last 10 years, more or less, many times as the RevOps team of one, which, by the way, was the topic of our previous webinar with RevGenius, so you can go ahead and watch this as well. But as a team of one, I always felt that knowledge transfer, or in general, knowledge in RevOps is all on me. It's all under my responsibility. What will happen if I would leave the company? I'm the only one that knows about, critical things to our tech stack and processes. And to be honest, in many cases, I also felt that I'm the only one who cares. Having said that, we have today an amazing team of professionals that built amazing RevOps teams and are definitely not in the position of like RevOps team of one. So today we're here to learn about how we can actually build the right culture of knowledge transfer in RevOps, not just to protect people from or to protect the knowledge from people that are leaving the company, but actually how we can use this, use those techniques, use those strategies in order to scale organizations. And with that being said, I'll be happy. And of course, I will say before we even start, you're more than welcome to be part of the discussion, to leave questions, to leave your comments and your thoughts. It's very much a panel and not a lecture, and we're happy to see all the great comments here. And with that being said, I'll hand it to Lindsay to present herself. We'll start with presenting the panel, and then we'll start with asking some questions. So Lindsay, good morning.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsay Roethlisberger. I lead the RevOps team at Zapier. I've been in marketing and marketing ops for at least the last 15 or so years. I've worked at both large enterprises and at startups. I joined Zapier as a marketing ops team of one, and we have now grown to a full RevOps team, which I lead. So it's been really exciting to sort of see RevOps evolve as it is today. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Lindsay. Greg.
Hi, everyone. My name is Greg Larson. I'm currently the VP of RevOps at Eltropy. We're a fintech software company. I started here just like Lindsay as a team of one, actually as a consultant, and built it up to a full RevOps team, and currently also run Catalyst Sales Consulting and consult companies on their RevOps procedures. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Greg. Andy, good morning.
Yeah, Andy Mowat. I have run RevOps at 4 unicorns. I run it RevOps at, I call it GTM Ops rather than RevOps at Carta today. I've also done it at Upwork, Box, and CultureAmp. I've joined two at kind of the 4 to 500 million mark, and then taken two from, call it 20 million to over 100 million. Our team's about 4 today. When you guys pinged me on this topic, I said, this is not a topic that's a pain point for me. And then I realized there's reasons why. And so I'm excited to share them on this webinar.
Thank you so much. And yes, we're definitely excited because I remember, I was just talking with Andy a few days ago, and we were talking about, when you have such a big team, this is not a challenge for you. But having said that, I'm quite sure that there are certain things that other companies could learn, even if they don't have so big teams as you are describing. And I guess, just to set the ground here, and Andy, we'll start with you. Why knowledge transfer is important? Or maybe we can start with, what is knowledge transfer?
Knowledge transfer is understanding how systems and processes are done so that people that come behind you, work with you, understand that as well too, and you're building on knowledge rather than recreating it over and over again.
Okay. Any other thoughts, Greg, Lindsay, for better definitions or additional definitions for knowledge transfer?
I think Andy hit it right on the mark there.
For me, it was always around, I would say I felt like documentation is the thing, right? Knowledge transfer is always to document the things that you're doing. And I'll be happy to ask Lindsay, I'll hand it to you. When we talk about documentation in general, who's using it? How people should consume this documentation in the day-to-day?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of layers to this. We like to think of documentation as a way to, keep a source of truth of how things work. But I think it's also important to drive alignment at your whole organization so that folks understand why the process is in place and how it affects them, and making sure that things like definitions are standardized across the organization. So I think it plays this important role of not only keeping business continuity and making sure that everybody has a sense of how things work, but also sort of making sure that the entire org knows why a system is in place and how it affects them.
So when you're saying this why, we're also talking about understanding the context of things, not just how things are working, but why they were built. Do you think this is also important for the go-to-market teams? Because in many cases I see, and I'm hearing a lot of opinions around it, of the ops role as kind of service providers to the go-to-market teams, right? The sales reps, the marketing teams. And the question is, who is actually using this documentation? Who should access this documentation in the day-to-day? Should it be the huge RevOps team that they need to share the knowledge in their team? Or is it something we're expecting to be kind of self-serve to teach the reps how to use it?
I think that it's both. I think that it has to serve both purposes. And I think that another thing that documentation actually allows your RevOps team to do is not get into this cycle of answering questions constantly for folks, which just sort of can keep RevOps sort of confined to being question answerers, ticket takers, fairly reactive. So documentation is also actually a way to sort of like free your RevOps team to make knowledge self-servable to your larger org, allowing RevOps to focus then on solving some of the bigger problems.
Yeah, I love it. And I would like to hear Greg a little bit, and I think it's a great segue to ask Greg, when we're talking about, and what you mentioned, Lindsay, I think it's a very smart approach, because we're seeing RevOps from one hand complaining about them being like the ticket solvers, right? But from the other hand, they know that they hold the holy grail. They know things that nobody else knows. But when we're trying to scale an org and we're thinking big, this actually can hold RevOps people back, right? It can hold them back from growth opportunities, and it can also bring some risk to the company and the company's revenue. So, Greg, what do you think is the risk when there is no knowledge transfer in an organization?
Yeah. And I've been in a lot of organizations where it's a team of one or very few. And the initial risk that people think is, okay, when someone leaves, all of a sudden we're back to the Stone Age, and nobody's going to know how to do anything. And really, that's not always the case, because if you are a proficient RevOps operator, most of the things you've put in place aren't going to break the minute that you leave. Right? People might not know how to do them, but most of them will actually probably run without you and efficiently if you've set it up correctly. So the big thing for me, the risk that's inherent if you don't have proper documentation, is that people don't build on it. They just kind of go with the status quo because they're afraid to touch anything and break anything or change anything. And eventually, yes, it will break if you don't have someone keeping it up to date. But in small organizations, just even the most simple documentation of this is what's in place, not even how it works, but like this is what's in place, so that people can understand and learn. And as you mentioned, as you surface that up to executive teams and your leaders and your managers, that will get a lot of conversation going. Is what else can we do? How can we improve this? How can we make it more efficient? hey, have we ever thought about this? They might not know how to implement that, but those conversations can be sparked by proper documentation of like, hey, this is all the stuff that's going on in the background. And it can actually give you some credibility as well. Like, hey, you're not just the report builder and answering questions. You're actually building automation that's advancing the company. And that documentation can kind of be your cheerleader of like, hey, you know, look at this stuff that's already in place. So yeah, for me, risk is it's there, but it's more like, hey, how do we build on this? How do we not bring the company to a halt if there is no documentation?
Yeah, I agree. You know, for me, documentation was when I was more in RevOps. I remember for me it was you mentioned Stone Age. I like always to look at this as you know, those dusty spell books that you see in movies. You have this old book, nobody's really touching it, and then it also for the RevOps itself. For me, it was like a daunting task. It was always the thing that I pushed to the bottom of the backlog. Like, I need to document it at some point, and I want to go back to you, Andy, with like understanding what is a better way, or what are better ways to create culture of documentation, which is not like the RevOps need to write a long Google Doc or a slide that nobody will ever read. How do you incorporate it in the day-to-day routine of the RevOps team?
Yeah, I mean, I think you start off with the individual one person's really passionate, so they document a bunch of stuff in Lucid Chart. Then you try to create, like, that's kind of like the Stone Age. And then next would be you create a culture across your team of documentation, which is good. I still think it's like, how do you automate documentation? Because we've been talking about it as this monolith of like documentation good. But yes, it is. But like, how much detail do you go down into? It's always changing. And so I tend to think of, you know, tools like Sweep, which you can automate it. And then there's the final stage, which is for me, which is you actually invest in your people. And so I look at it at Culture Amp and Box and other places, like literally a good chunks of my team are still there, right? Like the fact that we don't have high turnover on RevOps is a good thing. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the people. And then I guess the final stage is I just outsource some of that core knowledge, right? Like we used external firms and they don't leave you, which is one of the nice things about that. So I think I look at it, you know, it's funny, like I don't stress documentation at all because I'm thinking further down the funnel of like, how do you create a great culture where people don't leave you? And if you reduce turnover, documentation is a lot less important too.
First of all, there are a few interesting things that you said here that we can pause on, because you just brought an kind of refreshing approach, saying that in some points you can have outsourced consultants, and it's kind of works the opposite, you know, in the growth of a manager. You always want to have like a big team and have more people, and now you're saying leaning on outsource in some points might be effective for the long run because they will never leave you. So what kind of consultants, like what about outsource information resources do you think companies should consider having?
Yeah, all those RevOps fractional people are leaning in and getting really excited. But I think at a fundamental level, what I would say would be, this is not outsourced strategy RevOps. This is outsourced systems, right? So we used a firm called Black Tab. Nolan was just amazing. Like I showed up and I was like, oh man, we're gonna have to get rid of this guy. But I realized how good he was, and he was with us for all 4 years. He works with some top companies. Jenny Guarta at Go Nimbly is another good example, right? Like her team is a extension of the technical team for some really big companies. So you can use it in really smart ways. And when somebody's a outsourced contractor, that is a revenue stream that they never want to lose. So they're never walking out the door, and you've got a neck to wring. Again, they can have turnover on their team, but I feel like that's a core part of the contract that we have with those firms to be able to do that stuff.
Yeah, I love it. And I actually think I'll be happy to hear from you, Lindsay. And again, I think Andy mentioned some tools that we can use. Sweep is one of them, or in general, how we can automate this process of documentation. And I guess my question is, and especially for, I would say, more junior RevOps that are trying to, fight for budget. And we know that RevOps are not usually buying tools for themselves. They usually, responsible for buying tools because there are needs from the go-to-market. How do we convey our leadership that we need to buy a tool for documentation? Like, what's the use case internally for companies?
Yeah, from my point of view at Zapier, we're not as mature as some of the examples that Andy shared, so probably not quite ready for that stage. But we are still sort of figuring out what our go-to-market motions are. We're in a highly experimental phase where we're changing processes, changing lead sources, trying new sales motions, and that makes it so challenging, I think, for a RevOps team to really be on top of documentation and having that central source of truth. So what we've done is we've created this sort of like lightweight way to just share information of the latest and greatest via these like weekly demos that we do on our team. So we might do, if somebody launches a new process or a new experiment, they'll record just a really lightweight Loom, and we also use Coda and Figma to document our processes. But bare minimum, a Loom, like here's what it does, here's how it works, and then you sort of start building that like a lightweight database of things you can kind of go back to and reflect on when you have a bit more time to go back and document these processes. So yeah, for us, getting buy-in with the leadership to like really invest in documentation and take the time to do so. It's really about actually using it to increase our team's productivity and agility, because if we have this documentation in place, we have a paper trail, to Greg's point earlier, that allows you to just continue to build on that and move faster. So that's the way I've positioned it in the past. Build this culture so that you're building up this like database of lightweight documentation, but in the meantime, tell that story to leadership about how this actually helps you move faster, how it allows you to focus on bigger problems, especially if you're in this like highly experimental, very fast moving go-to-market stage.
Amazing. I see in the comments here that people love the Looms, and it is a great idea, right? Just to have this knowledge term. I think I will share it with our internal RevOps, because I think I'm nudging him quite a while on like things that I already asked in the past and I just don't remember. He's sharp enough to to point those answers from the past back to me, just pushing them back in the Slack thread. But I love the Looms idea. I think it's a very smart idea. And Greg, I want to ask you something, and to open an interesting topic here, which is, I would say, how technical can you go in the documentation and this technical gap? And just to explain something, again, I experienced many times as RevOps, is I have the technical understanding of the system. Therefore, when I will write this documentation, I will try to do it in a way that I understand. But in many cases, the other readers, the people that should read this documentation, will not necessarily understand. I will give an example that I always love to use, is that when I'm, as a Salesforce user, I'm calling a lead, I mean the lead object in Salesforce. But for any other person in go-to-market, lead could just be a beginning of new business relationship. It doesn't have to be the lead object. And then we're starting to fight those nuances. What would you like to share with us around like best practices, how to bridge this gap between technical users and non-technical users?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it has to be taken into consideration. So my background is in sales and sales leadership, and it's the same thing when you're talking with the customer. You need to present it in a way that they understand and that they accept. And with documentation, there's kind of two avenues. There's technical documentation for your operators, your back-end folks, the ones building and needing to understand how it works. That you can get as technical as you need to, because if they don't understand it, they need to go understand it, and they need to learn that language and that process. On the other side, there's more like sales enablement, standard operating procedures, like that type of documentation needs to be what I would call customer facing. Sales, I won't pick on sales guys, and I used to be one. So sales teams understand things a lot differently than operations teams. And so you need to speak their language as you're presenting it. It doesn't have to be as detailed as Lindsay talked about earlier, the why, like this is why we do this. And what I've found is actually really helpful in my life and not double, because then, I got to create 2 sets of documentation now. And I got to go back and forth, is like Lindsay had said, creating looms or videos, explain, quick videos. I actually couple that with an AI tool called Scribe that will document every click, every mouse movement. It shows it in more of a documentation setting, because I can use the video for the sales team. Hey, here, we're in Salesforce. Here's how you go and close out this opportunity. And I just create a video. I walk through it. I can go real fast because they can slow it down and go back. But then in the background, Scribe is actually capturing every click, every process. And I can go back to Scribe and I can add more detail. I can go in and type out the exact field, the process. And so then my operators have, oh, hey, here's how I do this. I can then go add the back end stuff. And so it's saved me a lot of time to double up those both types of documentation into one process on my end.
I guess in this case, it's also helpful to reduce some of the frustration that sales reps have from the process, because many times we hear the go-to-market teams, the sales reps are complaining about leave me from the process, right? I'm here just to close deals. And then they struggle with all the technicalities and all the error messages. So it just creates this frustration of like, this system was not built for me, right?
Right. And that's where that's one thing I don't usually get that complaint, because coming from sales, I usually build the system to the sales team or the CS team rather than the operation or leadership team. But one thing that I've found is really helpful, most sales reps will never remember where all of this is at. I mean, you could raise your hand. Everyone's like, where is it at? So we actually create all of these how-to videos. We create it all. And then we put it in the universal link bar at the bottom of every Salesforce page. So if they ever get stuck, the error message actually points them to, hey, bottom of your screen, there's a how-to video, click there. And then it pulls up just a repository of Salesforce how-tos. And then in other systems, we have another, in Slack, I have pinned up at the top of the sales channel, hey, here's the how-tos here's your standard operating procedures. And so that's oftentimes an overlooked piece of documentation is how you surface it to people. Make sure it's right there where they're working, so they don't have to leave the system, go find it, get lost in some other task, and then they come back and they can't even remember why they were looking for it in the first place. So
yeah, this is also something that we in Sweep, we of course we use our own tool for this. We use Sweep for that because it really helps you to visualize the process. Andy mentioned in the beginning, some of the design tools that are really, as an operator in the past, I would build all those blocks. For me, it was the way I was thinking is very much in a schematic way, putting all those blocks. But suddenly, the way we do it with Sweep is like allowing any kind of stakeholder, if it's the business stakeholder or the admins and the technical people, really to understand how the process is built and then to go deeper into the right part. So we definitely believe in creating things visual and be wherever the people are working. So I think those are great tips. And yeah, I want to talk, I saw that we have some attendees today that are quite senior, coming from like the sales and revenue leadership side of the house. Tell us more about how important it is, this alignment, when you're working upwards, when you're working with other stakeholders in senior management, not just for the reps, for the day-to-day. How important it is for the head of sales, for the CEOs to understand the processes.
You're asking me or
Yes, I'm asking you.
It's not important.
It's not important.
No.
Why?
They don't read it. I assume, I love my stakeholders, but I assume low interest in documentation and process from stakeholders.
So you see yourself today as the person that, bridges this gap internally, like in the management team?
Yeah, we're the grease that makes the machine work. Without the grease, it's not there. I think I feel like, again, that's the cynical view for me, but at the fundamental level, like I never point fingers at my stakeholders. I always take the time to explain, educate, and help them understand. But I'm helping them understand like the why and the how, but not like documentation and process. Like they do not want to go there. Like no stakeholder will ever open a Jira. No stakeholder will ever open a Lucid. Like they just won't. And so I operate under that reality, and that means that my team has to support more in the background and be that thinking partner for people.
So let's maybe take another angle on this. What happens when there is a leadership change, right? There is a new person joins the leadership team. Let's say someone from the revenue side of the house, like a new head of sales, new VP sales, and you as RevOps has all the knowledge about how the organization was operated in the past. How do you transfer this knowledge to them?
Again, the cynical view, but it's the reality. Like I have senior leaders on our team that don't have access to Salesforce because they don't want it. They, we put them in the data. We put them in the data looker dashboards, and they operate at an executive level, but they don't need to get to that level of detail. I think what you might be referring to is more like a new marketing manager, right? That needs to work with MOPS, or a new head of inbound SDR that really cares about how things are routed. Like those aren't, when you say senior, documentation doesn't matter to them. I think there are plenty of stakeholders that ops will plug into where they legitimately should be asking those questions around documentation, but they're not senior level executive stakeholders. They're like business partner stakeholders in my mind.
Yep. I'd agree with Andy. I get nervous when senior leaders are, poking around there, because that means there's a big issue that is like, hey, I shouldn't have to deal with this. And what's going on here? You get a varying level. Andy has worked with some unicorns. I've worked at a few, but I've specialized in taking companies from 0 to 100 million. So early stage to 100 million. And the earlier you are, the more engaged the executive team is, but really it can't scale. They can't be worried about documentation because they need to be worried about everything else. And so that's where it's kind of our job to make it a non-issue, to make it so they don't have to think about that. But having it there saves you in the case that something breaks or something is like completely, just it goes off the rails. You can have some backup there, but yeah, they're usually not involved in the day-to-day.
Yep. Love it. Great comments. Lindsay, you want to add something to this, or should we go to our next topic that I think is super interesting?
No, it just makes it, I don't know, I think something just like sort of clicked for me where it's like really the good documentation, it's really just critical to making your RevOps team like a best-in-class team to where nobody else has to worry about these processes. And so sort of reframing the way we think about documentation as really serving us, like in order to be as successful as possible.
Yeah. Well said. I love it, and I agree. I do want to touch about something, Andy. You mentioned earlier about building the team and investing in the team. So if you can share a little bit, because what we hear a lot, and we can see it, across the board from RevOps people across all sizes, is like the RevOps burnout, right? Very busy, always firefighting. Issues in the system happens all the time. So many systems are being onboarded all the time, so you need always to deal with this thing. How do you empower your RevOps team, and today you have a huge RevOps team, not to burn out, right?
I coach almost every director level of RevOps, especially at smaller companies. Like you need to force trade-offs, period. Like if you're like, that's awesome, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, I can do that, you're going to get steamrolled. I had it at one company, like the sales leaders were just constantly complaining about my team. So I was like, great, I'm going to sit in on the next 4 weeks. And like in week 1, I'm like, okay, they're saying yes to everything. And they're not giving clear deadlines. And so like week 2, I looked at them and I said, that's awesome. Cool. That's going to be 9th on the list. Here are the 8 things above it. Do we have any issues? And they're like, nope, I understand. And so we went like that for 4 weeks. And in week 5, they handed me 2 headcount. Right. And so like when people realize that RevOps can't do everything all the time and is going to force you to make the right trade-offs for the business, it's key. So I coach my whole teams on that. Like you need to force the stakeholders. You need to like put a prioritization on something. You need to just explain and give visibility on what's above it. And then you need to force trade-offs. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't be in RevOps. But a lot of junior people don't get that. And they just say yes, and they get steamrolled.
Yeah, so true. So I think one of the cruxes is a lot of people that get into RevOps get in and their RevOps is new. It's a junior level role at companies when it's starting out. And so they're trying to make a name for themselves and they're like, yes. And it works for a little bit, but then that's where that burnout comes in. And so just like Andy, as I'm talking with other people, the biggest thing that I've seen help with that is to establish like a legitimate agreed upon from the executive level RevOps roadmap. And if you can get that out a quarter in advance of like, here are the key things that we're going to work on from RevOps, and this is the impact that we expect from them. And as you go through there, as you get requests, if it doesn't fall in the roadmap, you filter it out. And if you have a big enough team, you like I've been at places that have had like a triage team where it goes to like almost like level 1 support. They're going to work on it and kind of put it in queue. Everyone else doesn't even touch it. But if you can follow that RevOps roadmap, like Andy said, trade-offs, say no to people, it shows, hey, there's value. And just like Andy said, it always leads to more headcount. Or in my case, a lot of the times when I'm consulting with companies, that's where I get brought in, is like, hey, they don't need someone to run everything and be the strategy. They literally just have a bandwidth gap. They can't fulfill this in the manner they need to. So you bring in a consultant that can deliver on something that might not fit in the roadmap, but is urgent enough to go out and it's popped up that needs to be fixed. So that roadmap is huge in aligning your executive team with your goals and not getting sucked into the tactical side. One thing that I've done in my career to keep that going is I try to reserve Fridays, like Fix It Friday or something like that. The reverse of that. Hey, Strategic Friday, just have one day that's set aside to a specific, task, and make sure that you block out that time so that you can deliver on some things that may fall out of the roadmap, or you can focus from a strategic level for a full day so that you don't get sucked into the fires every single day.
For me, it was always asking why, right? When I got this request, and it's very important to understand. Again, I fell into this trap so many times that I said, someone doesn't understand anything, let me solve it for you. Okay, I'll do it for you. In many cases, I took the blame on myself and said, oh, the reason this person doesn't know how to do it is because I didn't explain it properly. So now I will go and fix this issue for them. And as I progressed with my career, I saw that asking why on things gives a lot of context, also brings great partnership in the go-to-market team, because you're not just a service provider to your go-to-market teams, you understand what they need. And one very good example, or we hear it all the time as a tip, is like shadowing the go-to-market users, right? To work with the sales rep. It's not just, oh, something is not working. It's really to be with them and to understand how they operate in the process. Then the things that are easy for you to understand, not necessarily easy for them to understand. And when you layer on top this why question, why do you need this? What are you trying to do? So giving more context is also bridging the gap between the technical people and the go-to-market users, but also create this culture of knowledge sharing, right? We've seen something that could work better. I did something else in my previous company, and now the knowledge transfer is not just a task; it's more of a culture. And I would like to hear more, Lindsay, from you, how we build this culture in the right way. How do we encourage this?
Yeah. I think like one of the big causes of burnout that I've seen is also when folks are working on things that don't feel like they're having a big impact, that don't feel like they're laddering up to like a larger outcome. And so they're just in this loop of execution, but not really feeling tied or connected to the results. So I think that making the space for this type of work and making sure that we're documenting all of our processes, it has to be very intentional. And the way that you get there is by making sure that your team is just very focused on outcomes that are going to impact the business in a meaningful way, to sort of empower them to be able to say no and to be able to push back on work that isn't going to move, the needle in the direction that you want. And so I think that's really the first step to building this culture of knowledge sharing and transfer, and making the intentional space for folks to be empowered to do that. Because if it's a really important process that they know is going to have a big business impact, it makes a lot more sense to put a lot of effort into making sure that people understand why and how it works. And so I think it's honestly more focus, maybe, is the advice that I give for folks there.
There is something that I always feel that, there are a lot of systems that are being generated all the time, right? Some of us know Salesforce for quite a while, but we also know that, there are other systems always being added. And in many cases, I find something, even internally today as a go-to-market user, I find like a feature or capability or something that this tool is doing that I didn't know it's doing, but I'm kind of like, should I tell anyone to do it? Or it was quite clear to everyone, like, duh, everybody knows about this thing. And I think there is something about not being shy to share, even if you know things or you don't know things, that can really help accelerate this internal partnership. Like, hey, I found this very cool forum. I found this very cool website. Check it out. And you will be surprised how many people didn't know it and how many people could use it. And again, I think it's not always, it shouldn't be the reactive approach. It should also be the proactive approach. Everyone that finds something cool, everyone that finds something that could change the productivity should push it in the company so everybody could know about it. The worst case or the best case will be the RevOps will learn something that they didn't know before, and they will bring it into the company. Is it something that you've seen happening that you can share a story about?
Was that a question for me?
For anyone that has a story about it. But Lindsay, it's going to be you.
Andy just came off mute.
Oh, busted. We at RevOps at our last, I always create the traditions of sharing stuff out. I think maybe it was Lindsay that mentioned it too, around like a weekly type of thing. But at Culture Amp, we did something. We kind of sent out a newsletter and kept it really high level. And we basically had like, what's the one data insight that we've had from the last week? What's one piece of feedback that our stakeholders have given us that's helped make us better? And what's like the coolest thing we saw this last week, right? And people read that. And we spent a lot of time on it. This right now, we basically just sent out like a 3 to 5 minute video on a specific topic just to educate the teams. So like this week, we sent one out on like, how do we buy go-to-market systems? And so we spent a lot of time like investing in really high level education to help people understand our teams better, right? Like we're reinventing the data foundation at Carta right now. And so I needed to educate people on like, how are we going to do things differently? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that stuff. It's not like conscious, but over time, I think, RevOps has to have a voice to educate people on this stuff. Don't know if that answers your question, but I figured I'd.
No, definitely. I think they're all good tips on how to bring documentation, not just as a task. Because when I remember this when I thought about it in the beginning of this conversation, and even when we planned this event today, this webinar today, I was thinking about this daunting task of you need to document your processes because it's part of the work of RevOps. But we are aware that RevOps is becoming more and more strategic, and this is obviously what we're trying to push for as RevOps ambassadors. And the question is how can we take this project, this task, this sometimes thing that might be annoying. And Lindsay, you mentioned the impact on the revenue. I wanted to ask you, like, how do you convey someone in RevOps that documentation has impact on revenue? How do you make it an interesting task? And the tips that we're hearing here is a lot around how how to bring innovation, to use tools, to think outside of the box, and not just to make it a project of creating this static document, but actually bring it into something cultural, something that people are always on top of, something that encourage people to share and to bring new ideas. And I think those all fantastic tips. But Lindsay, I do want to go back to this question because I didn't ask it before. How do you make it an interesting project for someone? How do you convey that this is impactful on results and revenue?
Yeah, for us, one of the lenses we've sort of taken to our documentation too is how it actually impacts the customer experience as well. In RevOps, we're often thinking about internal teams and how, we all work behind the scenes. But I think that ultimately, like, our processes are really key to everything a customer might experience with your go-to-market teams. And so taking that lens as well. And one of the things that we do, I think it's now, we haven't been as frequent every couple of months, is we'll sort of do a customer journey audit of like how a customer experiences an underlying process that we put into place. So that's been an interesting way to like frame for the RevOps team, like how these processes are actually tied to like customer outcomes and how they experience our brand. But I do want to touch, I love what Andy said about sort of this other layer of communication, which is more about like the steady drip of information in your org about the problems that RevOps is trying to solve. Like, I think that's also just so key. We talked about how, all of the documentation of processes for go-to-market teams is really important for making RevOps like a super high functioning team that can drive results. But then there's like sort of a layer above it of like, maybe we're not sharing like the exact processes and how everything works with executive and senior leaders, but we're talking about sort of like these things that we're thinking about as a RevOps team who has visibility across the entire customer journey. And that's a really, really unique perspective that I think is like almost just another like important element of this knowledge transfer and just positioning RevOps in your org. And I think it's hard to do, but it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, you got to do it, Lindsay. It's like I've learned it over time. It's like you got to, like, people don't appreciate all the stuff RevOps does, and so we did it. I remember at Box, I joined, and the CCO was like, "You've got to read the head of analytics' like weekly newsletter," and I was like, "Wow, that's awesome!" I was like, "We need one of those." So we built it at Box, and then we did it at Culture Amp, and then we do it here. Like, I think there's so much cool stuff that RevOps is doing, or there's so many meetings where you join and they're complaining about something and you're like, I know we're just about to work on it. So a lot of these videos for us are like, my team can take them and be like, I know you're complaining about data, but here's what we're doing about it. And so it can really change the narrative for RevOps as well.
I've experienced the same thing, surfacing like a weekly memo or just pushing it up there and not just making it a list of like, hey, here's everything that we did, but showing like what it's solving and the impact, what you're solving for, and what that's actually led to at Eltropy, which is actually the first places this has happened. Is actually really cool. Is the CEO has started to share the board meeting notes with our RevOps team, and basically say like, here's all the things that we're worried about, the issues, everything, because he knows proactively we're going to go in there, and in our weekly meeting I'm going to be like, hey, can we help with any of these? Because if you're proactively surfacing that and like, hey, here's an idea on how we could help reduce churn that we're experiencing with this singular product. We go into the data set, we've identified a few things, we build a process, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, like you're, Aviv, to your point, that's where you're impacting revenue, not just building things to build them, but you're actually solving some of the headaches and issues that the company's facing that aren't even touching you, but you're able to go in and identify those. So
yeah, Greg, one thing I've always created, we have like if you have Slack, we have a bunch of behind the scenes channels. We have one called GTM Ops Cascade, where I encourage like any of my team that are in any meeting to like share that visibility for the rest of the team. So like we sit in and run all the metrics meetings, but not all of our team sits. And so when you said like CEOs sharing the board decks there, we do the same thing of like, this is what was discussed on the board. And like the more I can educate our teams on it, the more effective we are as well too. So there's a lot of like cross-functional idea sharing that we do.
And it gets people excited. Like to Lindsay's point, if you know you're working on something the board's talking about and the CEO's talking about, you put a lot of effort into it versus, hey, I just need to create this report for, the VP of sales that needs a different report filter. And they don't know how to do it themselves. So, you got to do it.
Love that. The other thing I do too is we bring in a lot of external teams, right? So I'll bring in like, Lindsay we'll bring in the MOPS team from Zapier to talk to our MOPS team. We had like Okta. We were talking about attribution. We were thinking about like data analytics. And so we brought in like the Splunk team. And so like, I'm a big fan of like that, making RevOps not just an internal role, but also an external role too.
And then this is a very smart thing in terms of knowledge transfer, right? Knowledge transfer doesn't have to be internal thing, could be an external thing, right? We can externalize those things, create this culture. People could be proud of this culture and talk about it in other places. And obviously those things should always help. I love it. I also had another thought, but I obviously forgot it because I was excited from Andy's idea right now. But we are heading towards the end of the session, more or less. We have 15 minutes to go. At this point, usually I'm asking participants if they have any questions, and they can drop it so we can see what questions are being answered and whatnot. So before we wrap up, if anyone from the people that join us today have some question to this lovely forum, they want to ask it here to be answered, please type it in the Q&A now. I do see a question from Jake quite a while ago that was not answered yet. That is, who is expected to create, own, and maintain all those documents? And this is especially critical when the teams are going big, because obviously when you're a team of one, it's always the RevOps. But share some ways of how you're doing it, Andy, today in your company when you have a lot of people. Is it like a one person responsibility? Do you have like a team? Is it a rotating responsibility?
I don't know. That's the best part. It just works. We've got the right culture, and I look at it, and I also think through in terms of redundancy on teams and knowledge too. So like different teams are different ways. Like over time, I that has not been the first focus for me, but over time we'll create that culture. And I think we have a business technology team that's very, very good, and they have full-time architects for Salesforce and marketing systems. And so like I look at it as like that's those people's jobs at that deep level. And then there's a lot of the education, which I care a little bit more about, which is like, how do we educate the stakeholders on how the basic things work and why they work in those ways? So I think it's just you create the right culture. It's no one's job. It's all of our jobs.
Yeah, and there is one thing that I want to say earlier. I think one of the things that we should also encourage is the feedback coming from the people that are consuming this documentation, right? Or those this knowledge transfer, because it's one thing to share those newsletters or looms or all those great things, but in many cases, and again, RevOps are people as well. We need that feedback. We need to know if this is helpful. Sometimes it could be just thumbs up, or somebody that's replying back to you. We're used to get, as RevOps, you're used to get all the bad things, like all the complaints, but not really get a lot of successful moments. But in this case, I think this is also important to work with the sales leadership, that if the sales reps are consuming those videos and they're reading those newsletters and they're enjoying it and it's helpful, let's make sure that the feedback loop is also happening when there are positive things. When they say, great, this was a great video, I recommend everyone to watch it, this will empower also the RevOps. They will know they're on the right track. They will know people are reading and using their thing, and this could be a very big catalyst for creating this culture. So with that being said, we're 10 minutes before end of time. I would like to do a quick round of summaries, maybe a funny story about when documentation has really saved you, or just some some thinking and notes on this topic. So we would go from Greg this time. And of course, if anyone wants to get some tips from you, Greg, where they can find you, and then we'll do Andy and Lindsay, and we will call it a day.
Awesome. I'm gonna reverse that. I'm gonna share a time when lack of documentation hurt us. So I had mentioned that at Eltropy, I started out, I actually joined Eltropy as a consultant, part of my consulting practice, and then came on full time after about 6 months. As I was in the consulting phase there, brand new 2 million ARR company trying to get things set up and running, and no systems, no process. We were moving over to Salesforce. I was starting to document some things, and we missed a step or missed a process, and it ended up in one of the marketing managers disassociating every single opportunity in Salesforce from the account. And being a consultant, I wasn't all the way in there yet. I was like, oh, no worries. We'll go to the backup. Oh, we don't have backups turned on. And we'll go to opportunity field history. Oh, no, none of it was turned on. None of it was set in place. And so because the documentation didn't exist of how he needed to do this process correctly, we essentially took $2 million in ARR and had to completely, there's no contact associated, no account associated. The opportunities weren't named with the account name in them. It was just like I had $2 million of revenue that I could not tell where it came from or who it was or when it renewed or anything like that. And so we had to nuke the system. We took it all out, had a team of interns look through every single contract we had the paper contracts and reinsert them into Salesforce. And so, it turns with documentation, it doesn't happen. With proper backup documentation, it's a 1 week fix, and it turned into 2 months of manual work just because we didn't understand exactly the process that needed to be followed for the procedure that he was trying to do. And so that's the horror story there. That
absolutely a horror story. Everyone in RevOps knows that this is a horror story. I wanted to finish with good stories, funny stories. Greg put it like on the other side of thing, but it's a real story. And this is
fear is a big motivator, right? When it's midnight and you got to get a process put in place, fear is a big motivator. But,
so when you're pitching a documentation solution to your management, just bring Greg as an advocate who will help you to generate this fear internally from not having documentation. Thank you so much, Greg. Where people can find you if they want to get one of your
you can connect with me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's probably the best. Just Greg Larson. There's not too many of them, so you can search me out, and I'll throw the link in the chat there.
Thank you so much. Andy, you're up next. Summary.
Hunger is also a big motivator. It's the end of month, and so we've got breakfast burritos at Carta I think the symbolism there is, don't just think about your ops team, think about how you're engaging your stakeholders. Like, we have a monthly tradition where at the end of the month, no matter what day it is, even if we're work from home, like, we're all there to support the sales team. So I guess I would, I think my whole point in this entire session was think bigger than just documentation. Like, there's so much more to making an effective RevOps team. So over to Lindsay.
I had a horror story too, but no, I don't want to end on that. So maybe I'll talk about a recent product launch that we just had, and we're selling a whole new offering for our sales team. has been really hungry and excited to sell this new product. And we launched it a couple of months ago now. But I think because of all of the documentation and preparation that the RevOps team put in, like, not only did we document the selling process, all the tools for the team to have, a new quoting and discounting process, sort of all of it came together around this launch. And so there were a lot of really intricate pieces. But I think what we did was we told a really clean and simple story about how to go sell these bigger deals. And on the day of launch, we got 0 questions from the sales team around process or like how things work, which I think that is like a really like telling, example of when documentation works really, really well in our favor. So.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And people, where they can find you if they want to get one of your tips?
Yeah, on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's the best way. Lindsay Roethlisberger.
Amazing. Okay, guys. So first of all, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone that participated today. Of course, to our speakers and to RevGenius for arranging this fantastic event. I think we have a very important takeaway from today. Knowledge transfer is not a task; it's a culture. And it should be driven by RevOps professionals, not just for the sake of the company and the risk of losing revenue, but actually in order to really invest, in this role, in the future of this role, and not just talking about being strategic, but really those are amazing tips that we got today, how to shift yourself into strategic mode. And I see, again, we have people from all across the spectrum, from individual contributors to sales leaders. I hope that we all have better understanding on easy and accessible ways to do it today, using technology, using tools like Sweep or any other tool, from recording videos or keeping things in your Slack chat. Great tips, great insights. We will be sharing this video, so if you want to share some of the insights with other folks that couldn't join today, or internally in your organization, this will be available. And with that being said, I will give you all a few minutes before your next meeting. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.